To those of you who are regulars, welcome, and to those of you who are visiting us, we're very pleased you're here for a special opportunity this morning. For several years now, King University has partnered with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. to bring in members of the Survivors Bureau Speakers Board. We have had many of these through the years and are delighted today to host yet another in that series who has not been here before, and Susan Warsinger. I'm only going to say a couple of words at the moment to keep her time at the max, but I do have a couple of announcements. One is that if you'd like time to talk to Susan a bit at the end, we're going to walk over to Tadlock, where I will have some coffee, and if you want to come have a chance to chat with Susan at the end, feel free to do so, but we'll be more comfortable over there. So we'll be going to Tadlock after the talk today. If you have other questions about the Holocaust Museum, we also have with us Carrie Bannister, who is traveling with Susan as a representative of the museum. We've got one other announcement, which is that we're rescheduling Dr. Ben Koch's faculty lecture because Justo Gonzalez, our scheduled speaker for March 19th, has had to cancel. We're going to move Dr. Koch's talk to March 19th. We will not have a March 12th event. So reception after. One other announcement which I will remind you of at the end is that Susan will be speaking again tonight at First Presbyterian Church in the Fellowship Hall at 7 o'clock. So if you have others who couldn't make it this morning, please encourage them to come and hear her story tonight. To introduce Susan is to do an injustice to her talk because I don't want to steal her thunder. She's going to come tell you a remarkable story of her own life. But I will say a couple of things briefly. She has been, for many years a school teacher, retired in the state of Maryland. She's been involved with the Holocaust Museum since before it began, doing translation work out of German initially, and then going on to work as a tour guide, especially with law enforcement groups. A great many law enforcement groups in this country have taken the opportunity to go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she has been one of their guides. She's been a speaker as well for some time, and we're delighted to have her here. She told me that her married name, Warsinger, War and Singer, it's easy to remember, was actually misspelled from the German. When her husband's family emigrated, the name in German was Warsinger, the singer of truth. And this morning, it's our great privilege to hear her singing the truth to us in her reminiscences of the Holocaust. Please welcome Susan Warsinger.
Hello, can you hear me all right? I think I'm going to be walking around. Is there anybody who cannot hear me? Please raise your hand. Oh, good. Anyway, you've been taking a look at the map of Europe in 1933, and Germany is highlighted, and I was born in Germany. If you go over all the way to where it says Belgium, there's a little town in Germany. It's called Bad Kreuznach. I don't know if anybody ever heard of it, but if you've heard of it, let me know. Raise your hand. You have heard of it? Well, good. We'll talk about it later. Anyway, so I was born in Germany, and I was a very little kid in 1933. When Hitler first came into power, I was 4 years old. This is my mom and my dad and my brother Joe, and I'm going to be talking about him a lot. He's the one that's standing next to my mother, and that's me holding my arm around my dad and my baby brother, Ernest, and I'm going to be talking about all of them quite a bit. That's me. In Germany, they have a custom that it's part of the culture, and they still do it now. So when a kid first goes to school, goes to first grade or to kindergarten, they get this cone. What do you suppose is inside of the cone? Anyone want to take a guess? Something sweet? Candy, you're right, I heard it. It's candy. The thing was filled with candy, and so the custom is to give the child on their first day of school this cone so that their school life is going to be sweet and wonderful. But things started to change as soon as I got to first grade. This is written in German cursive. Anybody know how to speak German? Okay, so I'll read it to you. It says Der Giftpilz. And if you take a look at the cover of this book, this is a picture storybook, and I don't know if you remember when you went to first grade, you know, your teacher read to you a lot of picture storybooks, and whatever she said, you know, was the truth. And this is what this teacher was teaching them. Does anybody know what a Giftpilz is? Maybe you can figure it out. It means that it's a poison mushroom. So these kids are learning in first grade. The kids where I was were learning in first grade that Jews, because this is a Jew, you see the Star of David, you see, and there's a big nose, and they're learning that Jews are ugly, and people laugh at them, and that they're poison mushrooms. So this is what the kids are learning in first grade. So I was Jewish, and so the kids knew this, and so they started to bully me, and they made fun of me. And I'm telling you, every day I went home to my mom, and I used to tell her, I do not want to go to public school anymore. She says, well, you have to, because you have to learn. So one day I was extremely happy, because I didn't have to go to school anymore, because there was a law in Germany that said Jewish kids are not allowed to go to school in the public schools anymore. And teachers, Jewish teachers weren't allowed to teach. Professors in colleges weren't allowed to teach if they were Jewish. But my parents, the Jewish, there were some Jewish families in our town, and they were very worried about their kids learning their subjects. So they hired the teacher, and the guy who is, you know, writing something on a piece of paper, he's Jewish, and he was our teacher, and they hired one room, and all of the kids from first grade to 12th to 10th grade were in his class. So the first grade sat over here, and second grade, third, fourth, fifth, and so they were all, and this teacher had to teach all of the subjects to all of the kids. So it must have been a terrible job. I mean, it must have been a hard job for him, but evidently he did okay. And this particular picture I found in my attic, it's all folded up. And what he did here is he was putting on a play, like a fairy tale, and he involved all of the grades together. And the girl that's holding the basket, that's Little Red Riding Hood, and that's me. And my best girlfriend was my mom, who was telling me not to go through the woods. So life for me in school was okay, because there was nobody to make fun of me in school, and I was really happy to be going to this one-room Jewish schoolhouse. This is a picture that we have in the Holocaust Museum. There's a lady who's sitting on the bench, and you can tell by her body language that she's very unhappy, because there's a bench that says for Jews only. And this lady, she's sitting in a park, and she's really upset because they had a bench for Jewish people, and they had a bench for non-Jewish, they called themselves Aryans, for Aryan people. Anyway, I want to tell you a personal story that happened in a park with me. You know, my mom used to, I was this little kid, maybe I was 6 or 7 by then. She used to tell me, she used to let me go to the grocery store by myself, and she used to give me money to go to the grocery store and buy some milk, or maybe buy some bread. And so one day she told me, Susie, that's what they call me instead of Susan, Susie, could you go buy some bread at the grocery store? And I was very proud to do it, because here was this little kid doing something for my family. So I went out of my house, just pretend this is where my house is. And all the way in the back where the love, where it says, love the Lord God with all your heart, right back there is the grocery store. Okay? And so, and where you all are sitting is the park. So in order to get to the grocery store, it was very easy. I could walk down the steps here and walk through a path and get to the other side to buy the bread. So one day I was walking down the steps, and as soon as I got down the steps to go through the park, there was a gatekeeper, and he saw me walking through the park, and he said, "Get out of this park. You cannot walk through this park anymore." And I couldn't figure out why I wasn't allowed to walk through the park. And he called me all kinds of names, and he called me a dirty Jew, and I really don't remember all the other things that he called me. So I ran home and I told my mother, and she told me, well, don't walk through the park anymore. I was this little kid, and I guess she didn't want me to know that all this hatred and anti-Semitism was going on in Germany at the time that the Nazis and Hitler started. So I went back in the house. So another day my mom told me, well, could you go and buy some bread? And again, she put the pfennig in my hand, and I knew I wasn't supposed to go through the park. And in order for me to get to the grocery store over there, I would have to walk all the way over here, then go down the street over there, and then walk all the way back over there and get to the grocery store. So guess what I did when I got to the steps? I was really said to myself, I'm very, very tired. And so guess what I did? You want to guess, Connor? Yeah, I walked down the steps and went down the steps to the park. And as soon as I got to the bottom, of course the gatekeeper came out and he started screaming and yelling, but this time he started to throw bricks and rocks at me. But the worst part of it was that he had a daughter, and she was just a little bit older than me. Maybe she was a 10th grader, maybe she was 11th. Yeah, maybe a 9th or 10th grade, something like that. And she saw her dad throwing the rocks at me and saying all these horrible things against Jewish people and me. And so she copied him. And so she did the same thing that her father did because he was her role model. And here was the parent teaching his kid about hatred and anti-Semitism. And I ran out of the park, and I tell you, I never walked through that park again. This is my brother, Joe, and I, and we look very happy because by this time, my father I didn't tell you at the beginning, my father had a nice linen store, and right after Hitler came into power, they had this law that all the people of the town boycotted his store, all the Jewish stores. So my father lost all of his business, and eventually he had to give up his store because he didn't have any customers. So we had to move from one house to another house that was smaller and less elegant than the one that we lived in at first. So anyway, here we are sitting on the steps, and my mother is about to have the baby, the picture that you saw, my brother Ernest, she's about to have him. And there was a law in Bad Kreuznach that Jewish ladies aren't allowed to go to the hospital. So my mother was having the baby in the house, and she had some lady help her have the baby, and so they told my brother and me to sit outside so we wouldn't hear all the commotion that is involved in giving birth to a baby. Okay, so this is an editorial cartoon that we have in the museum, and when the law enforcement officers and the FBI agents and the National Academy come, we always stop at this editorial cartoon because I think it's really representative of what was going on at that time in Germany. Can somebody tell me what you see? What do you see, Macy? One thing. What do you see? You see a what? A ghost. She sees the ghost sign. You see that thing, a ghost sign? Everybody can see that, all right. Do you see something else? Anybody want to volunteer? A swastika. That is correct. There's a swastika right in the middle. And what else do you see? Do you see a stop sign at the ends of the points of the swastika? Yeah? And do you see the go sign? There's a sign that says go, right? And there's one more thing. It's way in the back and has a sun shining, looks like a sunshine. What do you see there? Can you see those words? It starts with the E. Oh, come on, somebody read it for me. What's that?
Does the editing conference?
That's right. Thank you very much. It's the Avian Conference. Okay, so we have found everything that's on this editorial cartoon. I just explained to you. Right after Hitler came into power and all these awful things were going on in Germany against the Jews, all this prejudice and boycotting, and there was book burning and people lost their jobs. A lot of people in the world knew about it. Do you know who the president was in the United States at that particular time? Roosevelt, absolutely right. Franklin Roosevelt, yes. He was the president at that time, and he knew what was going on in Germany. And so what he did, he said, there were a lot of people who wanted to leave. And like in my family, my mother always said, let's get out of here. We want to get out of here. We don't want to live in this country anymore. And my father said, well, Hitler's going to blow over. I'm going to get my business back. Things have been good in Germany. And a lot of German Jews felt that way because, you know, President Hitler might blow over. So, but a lot of them wanted to leave. Okay, and so a lot of them tried to get out of Germany. So this editorial cartoon was like this. So Roosevelt said, all the countries in the world had a quota, a certain amount of people that they would let into their country, the Jews that wanted to live and get out of Germany. And so they got to a city called Evian in France, and they all met. They had this big meeting and in Evian, and they all decided, well, let us open up our quotas so some more of the Jews that wanted to get out of the country can come into our country. Well, guess what? Every one of those countries said, we're not going to open up our quotas because if they come into our country, they're going to take away our jobs and mess up our economy. There was one country that said, okay, we will take a lot of Jews and as many as I want to come, and that was the Dominican Republic. But that was the only one in the whole wide world that would open up their quotas. So here we are. Take a look at this. And right there, do you see we didn't talk about the man who's sitting underneath the go sign? Can you see what it says on him? There's on his pocket. Can you see that? It says non-Aryan, and you remember I told you before that the Nazis called themselves Aryan because that was supposed to be the pure race. So here's this non-Aryan who's sitting at the post, and he wants to get out of Germany, and the Nazis all tell him, get out. You know, this was way before the concentration camps and the ghettos. This is before. This is like in 1934, 35. They said, get out. We don't want you in our country. So this is what it's showing you. The people wanted to go, but after the Evian conference, there was no place for them to go. You probably learned about this, or maybe you haven't, but I'll tell you a personal story about this. This is a picture that we have in the museum. My brother Joe, the older one, but he's a year younger than I am. We were sleeping in our bedroom, and we were really very excited because it was going to be my mother's birthday the next day. And so it was like 11 o'clock, and we were still up. And all of a sudden, some bricks and some rocks were being thrown through our window. And my brother's always braver than I am, even though he's younger. He jumped out of bed and he pulled himself up and he looked out the window and he said to me, Susie, it is our neighbors that are throwing those bricks and rocks through the window, and our civil policeman is standing at the edge of the crowd, standing like this, and he's not doing anything to stop the people from throwing these bricks and rocks through the window. So we were really very scared. And so we rushed into our parents' bedroom where they were sleeping, and the baby was sleeping, Ernest was sleeping. And just then a rock came through the window, and he had this little crib, one of those bassinets. And the rock fell onto his hand, but it didn't hurt him, so that was good. So anyway, we were huddling in our parents' bedroom, and just then some people uprooted a lamppost that was outside, and they carried it on their shoulder, and they walked over to our front door, which was made out of glass, and they smashed it. And the glass was strewn all over the hallway in our apartment. And we were really very scared then. And so my father said, let's go and hide up in the attic. And so what we did is we lived on this building had 4 floors. We lived on the first floor, and on the second floor the rabbi of the town and his family lived, and on the 3rd floor was a non-Jewish family, on the 4th floor was an attic. So my father said, let's go hide in the attic. And so we rushed up there, and the rabbi was already there. And, no, not the rabbi's family was already there, and the rabbi wasn't there, and I didn't know what had happened to him. And I looked out the window, and he was standing on his porch, and there were these 2 SS men, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of them. They wore those beige uniforms with the swastikas on their arm, and they were holding him like this, and they were holding him like this, and he had a beard, and one of them came and cut off his beard. And rabbi at that time, it was very important for him to have a beard. Anyway, they hauled him off to jail because he never came up to the attic. So later on I found out, and then they broke a lot of things in our apartment, and they looted the rabbi's apartment from all of his artifacts that he had. And so later on I found out that they didn't only do it in our house, but they did it in every Jewish family's house that was in Bad Kreuznach. And not only that, all of the men were arrested on that night, and I found out that they burned down our synagogue. And then I found out later that they didn't only do it in Bad Kreuznach, but they did it in every Jewish community, wherever there were Jewish people living in Germany, all over every town. And that night was called, does anybody know? Yes, you're right, Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And it was on the 10th of November, and it was on the day that was my mother's birthday. So, all of the people that wanted, like my mother, who didn't want to leave Germany after the night of the broken glass, guess what? All the Jews that were living in Germany, nobody wanted to stay there, because that was the beginning of all the atrocities that were to come. Okay, so go. So you see where Greater Germany is? Just move west a little bit, and that's where Bad Kreuznach is. Okay, so you see that it's not too far from Paris. So my father found a lady who was doing it for business. She didn't do this for free. She was smuggling children across the border into France, and she had 2 children of her own. And so what my father did, he gave her, he had a little bit of money that he didn't have it in the bank. He had to have it hidden under the mattress. So all the money that he had saved for his whole life, he gave to this lady to smuggle my brother Joe and me across the border into France, and so that we would be safe, because all the Jews in Germany knew that nothing good was going to happen after this. So this lady, said she would smuggle us into France. Can you imagine how my parents had felt? And I'm sure there are some mothers here that are sitting here and some fathers who are sitting here, to send your kids away and not know if you were ever going to see them again. It must have been really terrible for my mother. Anyway, I was this kid, and so we thought they were going to come in 2 weeks or 3 weeks and meet us in Paris. So when we got to Paris, we had a third cousin, and he said he would take care of the two of us for a while. And so my brother Joe, he was very curious again, and what he did is he ran all over Paris when that cousin went to work, and the cousin had told us to stay in the apartment and not to move out of the apartment. But my brother always came back before the cousin came back from work. But you know, he couldn't keep these two kids. So what happened in the environs of Paris, there was this foster home, and there were organizations, and one of the organizations that helped my brother and me a lot was the Quakers that were here in the United States. And they helped us find this foster home, and eventually they helped. If I don't get to finish talking about everything, the Quakers were very good to us, and they helped us, my parents, find us. So I'm appreciative of the Quakers. So anyway, so here were and we lived in this little town, in this foster home, and we went to school, and I learned how to speak French, and I was really good at it. And so then we were still hearing a little bit. We were writing to our parents all the time, and we were writing, and we were wishing that they would come already. And all of a sudden, we stopped getting mail from my parents. We wrote to them all the time, and we didn't hear from them anymore. So I don't know if you learned about this in the history class yet, but now it's like we left Germany in 1939. That was, Kristallnacht was in 1938, and my brother got smuggled into France in 1939. And then, you know, Hitler said, I'm sure you studied this already, but he said, I'm going to go and take over all of Germany. So the first country he went into was Czechoslovakia, and he went into Poland. And then in 1940, it was in the May of 1940, at the same time that we were living in this little town around Paris, guess what he took over? Which country? France, you're absolutely right. And I remember my brother and I, we were in Paris on that day when the Nazis came marching into Paris. You could hear the boots, you could hear it, and you could hear the caravan, and you could hear the Nazis coming in. They were not only the Jewish people, but a lot of the Parisian people all wanted to get out of Paris because they were afraid of the Boche, because that's what the French people called the German army, the Boche. And so we were all running out of Paris. So some people went down to Vichy, and I'll tell you about the White Line in a minute. And some people went a little bit west and go back to Paris and go west just one little drop. And there is this town, there's a big palace where kings live. Does anybody know what that town is? I hear it, Versailles, you're right. Somebody said Versailles. A lot of people just walked. It's like if you go by car, it's like a 40-minute drive. They drove, and people went in a train, and people went on their bicycles, and people walked just to get out of there, and they went to Versailles. So here are all these people running away to Versailles, and what do you suppose is the biggest building in Versailles? The palace. So all of these people ended up going to the palace, and the poor mayor of the town didn't know what to do with them, but they needed some place to sleep and some place to eat. So when we got to the palace, what they did, and their beautiful gardens, if you ever, when you grow up, you might go to Paris and to Versailles sometime, and the beautiful palace, and they have gardens all around. Anyway, way at the end of the gardens, there was this big pile of hay, and they gave us these burlap bags, you know, what do you put potatoes in? Burlap bags. And all of the people, they filled up their bags with hay, and then they gave us a little string and we tied it up. And then we carried this thing which was going to be our mattress, and we carried it into the palace. And does anybody know which is the biggest room? Which is the biggest room in the palace? Anybody know? It's a real big room. It's called the Hall of Mirrors. Show it to them. This is it. Now, this is a picture that was taken not too long ago, and it has these ropes on the side, and the people are of tourists. So these ropes weren't there, and the chandeliers were all hanging down, but I don't remember those chandeliers that are standing on the sides. So what we did is, all of the people, we took our little mattresses and we lined them up in the Hall of Mirrors, and we slept on those Hall of Mirrors. And what I remember is that that mattress was really scratchy and it was itching my back because the hay was sticking into my back. But we were safe for a while. But what do you think? Do you think the Nazis only stayed in Paris? The German army only stayed in Paris? You're right. They came marching into Versailles also. So we hear this big caravan with these tanks and cars, and there was this head car, and I don't know what this man was. Maybe he was a general, maybe he was a major, I don't know, maybe he was a captain, but he's high up in the German army, and he gets out of the car and he wants to talk to the mayor of the town. Now, the mayor of the town knew only how to speak French, and this officer, this German officer, only knew how to speak German, and they wanted to speak to each other. And so somebody said, there's this little girl in the palace, she knows how to speak German. So guess who you think they were talking about? Yes, you're right, it was me. So anyway, they called me out, and I tell you, I was really scared because I didn't want to have anything to do with any German officers, because by this time things for the Jews in Germany was getting to be really bad because they were going into the ghettos. So the German officer said something in German, and I translated it into French, and the mayor said something in French, and I translated it into German. And evidently I did an okay job. I don't remember what they talked about, so don't ask me that. I don't remember. But anyway, when the conversation was over between them, the German officer, really tall, and I was as a little kid. I mean, to me, he seemed as tall as the ceiling, and he bent down to me and he said, "Little girl, how come you know German so well?" And so I was really scared, and I had to think for a minute, and I said to him, "You know, the French schools are very good, and I learned how to speak. I learned how to speak German in our public schools." So anyway, he left. So can you go back to the map for a minute? Thank you. I was going to tell you about the White Line. You probably will learn about it sometime in your history classes. You know, when the German army invaded all of Europe, and especially when they invaded France, they said to the French people, the inside of that line was going to be the unoccupied zone, and they kept the best part for themselves, you know, where the English Channel is, so they could attack to the Great Britain, and they were next to the Atlantic Ocean, and they said, this part right there, where Marseille is, you can keep that part for yourself, and you can still call that France, but the rest of it is part of Germany. But I tell you, the president that we had in that area, he was Pétain. He collaborated with the Nazis in the end anyway. But anyway, for a while, a lot of people wanted to go into the unoccupied zone. And so two nuns And I don't know how that all happened. Two nuns got a hold of my brother and me, and she took us to a little town, you see Vichy? And to a little town which was called Provernay. It was like a village, not even a town. Provernay, there was an old castle. And this is it. And there were all the children that were lost. And they were, well, all the children that were lost, and they ended up in this castle. It was called the Chateau de Morel. And so here we were, and by this time we're still writing to our parents, and we didn't hear anything from our parents, so we didn't know where they were. It was really upsetting for us. And so one day, go ahead next. One day, the director of the children's home of the Chateau de Morel, she called me to her office, and I was scared because I had always been a goody. My brother always got into trouble, but never me. And I couldn't figure out what she said. But she called me into her office, and she told me that my parents had found us. And as I told you before, my parents had gone to the Quakers, they had gone to the State Department, they had gone to the highest, they had gone to all the Jewish organizations to find us, and they helped them find us. And so where were my parents? So let me tell you what happened to them before you ask me that question. What happened was, my father had, after they sent us to France, my father had a cousin who owned a pickle factory in Brooklyn, New York, and he had asked her to please send her the affidavit so that he could get his family to the United States. Well, you know, in those days, anybody who sponsored somebody to come to the United States, they had to promise the government that they would not be a burden to the government economically, and they had to promise that they would find them a job, and they had to promise them everything. So between her and the State Department, the Quakers, and the highest, my father got to come to the United States, but it wasn't enough so that he could bring my mother and the baby brother. But eventually, all those organizations, and thank goodness for them, helped my mother and the baby to come to the United States. So here they were in the United States, and as soon as they got to the United States, my father and my mother did everything to find us, and so they did find us, and they sent us the tickets to come. So this is like, you know, when you used to go in elementary school, you used to go on a field trip and you used to wear a tag. So all the kids that got on this boat, which was called the Serpa Pinto, and the president, you remember when President Roosevelt had a wife? Do you remember what her name was? Eleanor, yes, I heard it. You guys are right. It was Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was in charge of getting children to come to the United States. And somehow she had like a group of 50 kids that were going to go on a boat that was, can you show that map of France again? Okay, you see where Portugal is? So there was a boat called the Serpa Pinto, and just look where the R is, and that's where Lisbon is, the capital of Portugal. And there was this boat called the Serpa Pinto, and it was like a luxury boat, not like they have now. It was much smaller, but they had, like in the hull of the ship, room for 50 kids in one of these rooms to take the they're telling me that I have to hurry up and dock. So anyway, to take these kids across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. So we went down to Marseille, and we went across. We'll get back to the map. Yeah, we went to Marseille, and then we went across the Pyrenees, and sometimes you learn later on in school about all of the people that fled through the Pyrenees, and they're like along top of Spain, and they went to the Pyrenees and tried to get out of Europe. And so my brother and I were lucky, and so we went to Portugal and we got on this boat, the Serpa Pinto. I get back to the Serpa Pinto. And so there's a big story that I'm going to tell tonight about what happened to my brother and me on that boat, but I don't have time to tell you about that. But I just wanted to show you, this picture was in the New York Times when the boat came into New York. And that's me, and my brother is there. And a photographer, like, where's that gentleman who's a photographer? Here, like, was standing there and he took pictures of the children. So I just have 5 minutes, I have 5 minutes to tell one story. Okay, so we get into New York, and all the passengers get off the boat, and but the kids don't get off the boat. The kids have to wait. And the doctor comes and he checks all those kids on the boat to see if they have any infectious diseases. And so my brother, he had been very excited while we were on the boat, and he had been eating a lot of pineapple, and he had been being very excited. He had found a stash of pineapple, and he was constantly up on board throwing into the ocean some of the insides of all the stuff he was eating. But in the meantime, he was also urinating in his bed at night, and he got this big rash from the pineapple. And so the rash wouldn't go away. So when those infectious disease men came to check him out, and they said, you can't come into the United States because you have this infectious disease. And I told him it was a rash because of all that pineapple and because he was urinating in the bed. And they wouldn't believe me because I was this little kid. So what do you suppose they did with us? All the other kids got off the ship. What do you suppose they did with my brother and me? Huh? Quarantine, yes. Now where do you quarantine people? That's right. Somebody's calling out. Who's the person who's saying all these wonderful things? That's right. That is right. They sent us to Ellis Island. And so we went to Ellis Island, and I tell you, my brother and I found out everything about the United States on that island. So when we got there, the first thing is they had us at these long tables and to give us something to eat. And they had this white bread on the table, these slices of white bread, and we had never seen such luxury in our entire life. We could take that white bread and we could squeeze it, and we could make a little ball out of it and then just eat it. And we heard that it was called Wonder Bread. So my brother and I were really excited. And then there was a sailor who was sitting next to my brother, and he was drinking this brown drink, and it had bubbles in it. And so my brother looked at me, he says, should I drink it? And I said, oh, go ahead. And he said, oh, it was really very good. And he found out that it was Coca-Cola. And so we said, oh my God, this really tastes so wonderful. And then we learned that all the kids in the United States had candy that you could keep in your mouth for a whole day. And it was called chewing gum. So anyway, my brother and I, we were Americanized with those three things right away. Anyway, I need to just tell you, I have 2 minutes, right? So anyway, so my brother's rash eventually went away, and I was really happy, and so they took us off of Ellis Island, and they brought us back to New York City, and there was my father who was waiting for us, and he in the car, and he drove us to Washington, D.C. And the reason we went to Washington, D.C. is because, you remember I was telling you about that rabbi who lived on the second floor? He had been saved also. He didn't go into concentration camps. And he moved to Washington, D.C., and then my father said, well, if that town is good enough for the rabbi, it's good enough for me. So anyways, I lived in Washington, D.C. all the rest of my life. So if you want to hear all of the stuff that happened afterwards, you'll just have to come tonight. I want to thank you very, very much for having me and for being such a wonderful audience and for helping me tell my story. I wish you good luck in your life, but I want to read one thing to you. It's only a very short paragraph. And I guess the reason all of your teachers got me to come here and got all the other survivors to come here is that here you are, these kids, you know, what can you do? I mean, what is it that you can do? I mean, you're just a kid. You can't just take care of the whole world. But let me just read this to you because I do that to most of my audiences. What do we have to do? We have to remember what happened. We cannot undo the atrocities of the past. Besides remembering, we have to take action to confront hate. We cannot be onlookers when we see injustice taking place. We need to understand what prejudice and hatred can do to people. We need to be sensitive to each other, and we should take care of one another. And I just want to leave you with those words and wish you very good luck in whatever you're going to do in your life. And thank you very much for having me.
Just by way of reminder, if you want to have some time to talk to Susan, we'll be in the Tadlock House. We'll also be going over to the cafeteria probably around 11:30. Come find us and come have a chat. Thank you.